agreeing to this. Can you first tell us something about the Young Foundation? What are the main areas of work at the moment?
Well, we have a long history as an organisation, mainly under Michael Young, who set this place up in the 50s. And most of its work during those decades was in some ways quite relevant to time banks, because nearly all the things he was involved in were ways of trying to strengthen both people's own capacity to run their own lives, but also mutual exchange. And so all sorts of things like the Open University and Consumers Association and mutual housing things and DIY garage co-ops came out of here. And what we've tried doing in the last year or so, since we relaunched the Young Foundation exactly a year ago, is rebuilding partly a research capacity, mainly on how people are living daily life, mainly with ethnographers and sociologists looking at patterns of need and behaviour and so on in communities across the country. Some action research, where the area which is probably most relevant to time banks is work we're doing on neighbourhoods in 12 cities across the UK, working partly with government to try and persuade them to pass real power down to neighbours from local government, but also what are the potential roles of neighbourhood councils, what are all the services they can run, the transactions, exchange systems and news systems and so on. It's going very, very well, that project, and I'm pretty convinced we'll have good legislation fairly soon, which will create lots of opportunities for time banks and all sorts of innovations. And the third activity we do is, going back to Michael Young's approach of creating new organisations, where we think there's a real need, some new possibilities, we try and put together new models of design, sometimes to actually get them going within these buildings. We own a series of buildings here, or in other cities across the country and a bit on the other side of the world. And again, some of those overlap with the Time Bank's agenda. We're looking at areas like chronic disease, new models of patient self-help, mutual help. A big project we're underway on a new model of schooling, which will involve a whole series of new sort of trading and exchange models around it, and a lot of web-based models as well. So, and probably the final thing to say is, although we're based in East London, in Bethnal Green, mainly working in the UK, but the interest in social innovation in all its forms is global. And we found very quickly we're being pulled into other countries. So several of us are off next week in China, where we're working in various cities on new innovations, southern India, Scandinavia, and so on. And I think more and more the UK has come to be seen as a real laboratory of innovation, social innovation for the world. We may not anymore be the greatest technological innovators, but we're still pretty good at inventing and implementing new ways of solving social problems.
Thank you. Our conference theme is the power of social networks. How do you view the importance of strong social networks?
Well, I think social networks are important in so many levels. I mean, at the very basic level, we now know more and more from research about how important your networks are to your life, to your well-being, even life expectancy of old people depends on the quality and strength of the social networks around them. So there's lots of issues around isolation and so on there. But I'm more and more struck as well how all change, in fact, comes from networks. I think often there are these rather sort of crude mental models of change. Either it comes from sort of parties and governments and manifestos, or the heroic social entrepreneur is the other kind of story of change. In reality, nearly everything comes from teams and networks and groups of people working together. And I wish we were a bit more realistic about that and smarter in how to harness the power of networks to achieve change, rather than going for these, say, slightly anachronistic views, either of top-down change, pulling ground levers, or, say, the heroic individual story, which was very strong in business 20 years ago and is now a bit strong in the voluntary sector.
Okay. Yeah. And what are your thoughts about the need for the co-production of our public services, and how can we help make that happen?
Well, I think most public services have always been co-created, co-produced, whatever you like to call it. It's always been true of health. For example, most of the gains in health don't come from anything doctors or hospitals do. They came from what people did in their own homes in terms of cleanliness and habits and eating. Education has always been a co-production. You cannot learn for someone, they have to do it themselves. And it's more and more being talked about in relation to the environment, welfare, and so on. And I'm glad the agenda is moving. About 10 years ago, I did what I thought was I did a sort of speech on co-production, how this was going to be the future of public services. There was absolutely zero interest. I then discovered, of course, 20, 30 years ago, lots of other people had made exactly the same speeches. And Ivan Illich, perhaps, is coming back as the sort of great as a theorist relevant to this decade. But at last, these ideas are beginning to permeate the sort of mainstream thinking about the future of health and education, welfare, the environment. And it's health, I think, that the opportunities are biggest, but also some of the challenges. As we have an ageing population, more and more people will be alive but suffering from chronic conditions of various kinds. And either you try and sort of operate medical solutions to that with ever more expensive technologies and hospital services and so on, at an escalating cost, or you find new ways for people to manage their own conditions alone or more likely in groups of fellow sufferers. And I think there's great scope for innovation around this, a lot already happening here and in other countries. And I think this is going to become the most exciting area of policy development. It's difficult. When I was in government, I got us to publish through the Cabinet Office quite a sort of detailed analysis of all the dimensions of co-production. And some of the philosophical issues there are around that. When do you require people to take responsibility? And often, some people would rather have a paternalistic state looking after them. How do you structure the choices? How do you avoid a very sort of nanny-ish state? How much is providing information to people enough? None of these are easy questions, but this is absolutely the territory in which public services will be for the time being. And again, I think this is a field where the UK is ahead. I was very struck a few weeks ago meeting a man called Michael Porter, who's a sort of business guru who's just written a massive book on health, who's hugely lauded by business CEOs and so on.